with this painting here, we will revisit this artist and the painting in a moment, but maybe just to get our brains warmed up. Any thoughts on what might be the artist's message or what they might be getting at here? Maybe that's too broad of a question. Let's see, Riley here. But maybe consider pulling, you kind of have to pull some of these elements together, right? You've got staircase or stairs. It's almost like an architectural drawing, then or blueprint. Likewise, the stairs are part of that building on the right. And you see, of course, the artist, or probably we can assume that she's the artist, perhaps transforming from the person on the right to on the left. And another element is, of course, the color, which probably has some meaning behind it, especially perhaps the contrast between living color and perhaps memory or um, maybe the inner world. And lastly, I see a map and a plane. And this will be something I think this will be a theme. Travel will be a theme today, but travel going both directions rather than one direction. Someone says, "Yeah, I dig it, but I don't understand it." Yeah, I think that's it. This takes a little time because I think it's a very, very deeply or it's very autobiographical picture that's probably about someone tackling something very specific and autobiographical, and therefore it's perhaps more intelligible to that person, but still has that kind of fascination that you would just by looking into someone else's world and knowing that they have a very complex inner world. One thing I think about when I see the map, of course, is travel, but also the plane seems to be facing left. And so that kind of implies like a return journey. And then you have these little dots, these little round spheres, which almost have like a video game quality. And so I wonder if there's, when I now as I kind of look at everything, what I tend to want to do is connect everything into kind of a journey, like maybe there's a coming of age journey, because you do see two sides of the same person. The staircase likewise has two, it's sort of flipped. And so it almost implies like a before and after or some kind of journey that comes full circle. And I do think that, assuming that might get us closer to the meaning, that will be an important theme today, especially when we look at contemporary artists and the desire to not burn one's boats. If you remember from last class, we talked about artists in the 1980s in Cuba and 1990s and during the Balsero crisis, taking one-way trips away from Cuba. And that is often the case in the recent history of Cuba. I think I heard that last year, 4% of the total Cuban population left Cuba. And that's a really, alarming number. Um, and you can imagine the circumstances that would make you want to leave your country. And this is a permanent, one-way trip. So the artists, I think, as we remember from last week, the artists in Cuba are an increasingly, I hate to use the word privilege, but I think there's an element of truth to that they have a unique position in Cuban society, being champions, or at least being trained by the revolution, and being people who can extol the virtues of the revolution just by sharing their artwork, um, either with people visiting Cuba or abroad. And that will be a really important cultural component of Cuba, I think, maintaining a sense of relevancy and or, maybe even cultural viability. Um, of course, you always have to remember there's sort of a separation between culture and politics with a little overlap or a lot of overlap depending on the circumstances. And so I don't think artists at all are kind of given specific orders that, you are an ambassador of the revolution. But I think there's a certain unspoken idea that, you were trained by the revolution, all of your college was paid for. So you probably are going to not want to bite the hand that feeds you, but especially in this era of artists understanding that the previous wave of artists left Cuba permanently, that if you want to kind of have a life where you're benefiting from the clout of being a Cuban artist, you don't want to leave Cuba permanently. And so today, what we're going to see, oh, that's fine, Shay. Today, what we're going to see is a lot of artists who have one foot abroad, either in China or in Europe or even in the United States, and 1 foot still in Cuba. And this becomes possible because the Cuban government allows artists, or makes it more possible for artists to leave and come back to Cuba. And so I think this wave of artists really benefits from continuing to have that status of being a Cuban artist, which is, unique because Cuba is a unique country politically and otherwise, but also benefit from being able to leave the country. And the reason why the Cuban government is allowing this is for the same reasons you might allow Doctors Without Borders, sending doctors abroad. It's a great goodwill campaign. There's a lot of benefits from building fences with your neighbors. And also it transforms artists into almost like a Che Guevara figure exporting the revolution, although I don't think that's a deliberate attempt by these artists. I think that's kind of going on in the background in the same way the United States might, export Peace Corps volunteers, right, to kind of improve relations from the ground level rather than, from the top. So it's sort of like carrot and the stick diplomacy. And so we will revisit this artist, Mabel Poblet, who's actually a good friend of mine and is someone you certainly should visit if you ever go to Cuba. She will have an exhibit later this summer in Miami, which I might consider going down to. It's hard for me to get excited about going to Miami, but certainly to go see a fellow artist, that would be neat. So I'll let you guys know when that is. So we will revisit her in a moment. And first off, let's kind of visit this, set up some context and look at how artists, or the era of art from the 90s into the 2000s and into the contemporary era, which, there's sort of these micro generations. And so it'll be, I think, a shift away from what we saw in the 90s. Perhaps for the short term, things get a little less desperate because Cuba reaches out to Venezuela. But as we'll see in more recent years, Cuba, and today, Cuba is almost gone back to, I'd say, a similar situation as a special period in the 1990s that we saw last week because of the shortage of fuel, particularly starting with the Ukraine war, and shortage of food. And a lot of this is because the U.S. embargo continues, but also because Cuba is very isolated economically. And of course, from the United States side, at least the State Department, they'll probably blame the Cuban government and communism, but I think all of us would probably understand the Cuban people are kind of torn between these two political realities. So let's see how the artists fare and flourish or don't during this period, and let's see how the art they make changes from tackling the circumstances they're addressing in the 1990s, namely the special period. So some of the themes we're going to see today is the commercialization of the art scene as part of an effort to attract tourism to Cuba. One of the great ways to get tourists is through the arts. Oh, it's okay, Jay. I got you here. You're doing all right. Attract tourists using the arts. Think about different ways to attract tourism. Tropical environment, hotels, beaches. Well, certainly there's a certain level of tourism which is interested in culture and the arts. And so the commercialization of the art scene happens. And a lot of artists in Cuba, their art reacts and comments on and is very self-aware about the sort of increasing capitalization of the Cuban art scene. Now, another theme is, not burning your boats, not leaving Cuba permanently, not going to Miami and struggling to have that same status that you left behind in Cuba as a Cuban artist. Then, of course, the death of Fidel is a major change in 2016. And I would call the generation that comes around then the Cuban millennials, artists who come of age in the last 10 or 20 years. And the next class, we'll be looking at graffiti art. And that's interesting because we'll be looking at people who are the equivalent of Banksy, people who are by definition critical of the institution. In Banksy, I think by definition is someone who you don't think of as someone whose work is in the art gallery or the museum so much as outside on the walls. And so a graffiti artist in Cuba is someone who is not necessarily trained by the revolution and is kind of outside the revolution. And that is really distinct from maybe artists who are trained by the revolution. And so we'll compare that to what we see today next week. Any questions so far? If you do have any questions, by all means, feel free to interrupt or to send a chat at any time. So I think this picture on the right kind of captures the self-awareness by Cuban artists of the Cuban art scene, kind of like a throwback to the age of prostitution in Cuba, sort of, I think, the awareness that there's an element of uh, like prostitution to the art world as you become more commercialized. I often heard the word puteria in Cuba, and it was used by Cubans to describe not just prostitution, but they use the word puteria, which means kind of prostitution. It's a little bit of a vulgar way to say prostitution, and but they were referring to socialism as puteria, which I thought was really interesting. Like people would say to me, watch out for that person. He might steal from you. He's a socialist. So they would use the word socialist or prostitute kind of interchangeably as a way to kind of criticize the idea that people are going to steal from you, or they don't have a sense of private property, but they meant it very kind of in a negative way. Well, I think these artists you'll see today are very much by the late 90s commenting on the changing realities of the Cuban art scene. And here is the school where a lot of artists are trained, or two of them. On the bottom, this is a place where a lot of uh, maybe cultural tourists like to go, because this is the art school, which is a really unique and wonderful building located outside of Havana. And you can appreciate how it blurs that boundary between indoors and outdoors. And you can almost imagine the rain falling and how it's designed to kind of collect all the rainfall, which is quite abundant. As you know, if you've spent the summer here in Florida, it rains pretty much every afternoon in July and June. And so this is a pretty unique place to study art. I mean, certainly a lot different than Ringling, less perhaps modern. So if you ever go to Cuba, you'll definitely want to visit this school. And so remember, all these students, these artists we're looking at, with rare exceptions, are trained by literally their schooling is paid for by the government. So this makes them very much kind of people who the revolution is invested in these artists. So the question I think we'll have to ask and wonder about is, are these artists that we look at today, are they going to be one of the last generations of artists who are truly kind of benefiting from the revolution, or will it continue on into the future? And we'll revisit that question towards the end. So at the end of the last lecture, the last class, we were talking about the return of Che Guevara's cadaver, or at least his bones, some of his bones, many of them from Bolivia back to Cuba, which is a major kind of moment of closure in terms of the legacy of Che. But of course, by this time, artists are starting to talk about the legacy of Fidel and Che Guevara, especially as Fidel enters the twilight of his, dictatorship, of his tenure as in charge of Cuba, and he'll pass off power to his younger brother, Raul, in 2008. And this is a shift, of course, a big shift, although Raul fought in the Sierra Maestra with Fidel. Once Raul is gone, I think it's a big question, is whether or not, the revolution can survive without that kind of patriarchal figure of Fidel or of Che kind of guiding and providing some kind of authority. And the word Fidel, of course, here is used kind of as a double entendre. It means loyalty. So I think the artist is playing with the idea of, are we still loyal? And it's written in blood. It looks like it's almost shaped like a red triangle. So there's many layers of cleverness and imagination here beyond the sort of obvious. And I don't think, writing the word Fidel is, you're playing potentially with fire, depending on the context, depending on the motive. And I think perhaps something Fidel written in blood wouldn't be something you would have seen in the 1980s in Cuba. So this is a sign that people are at least tackling this question of the legacy of Fidel. And that's a great contrast. That's a great contrast to what you see regularly on the streets of Cuba, next adjacent to the highway, perhaps on billboards, on the side of buildings, which is these kind of propagandistic signs that are very nationalistic. This says Patria o Muerte, which is, homeland or death, fatherland or death. And I think it goes to show that Cuba continues to have this very belligerent or combative stance against the United States because of the U.S. embargo. So even as Fidel fades from importance, we still have a lingering problem of Cuba and the United States having insurmountable differences that prevent a working relationship. So these billboards, I think, are a reminder that Cuba is very politicized, and it's reminders all throughout your travels around Cuba, that Cuba has a very hostile stance towards the United States, and in many ways, this politicization defines the kind of atmosphere in Cuba. So, for instance, as we'll learn about the protests, recent protests next week. So, the Cuban government blames a protest on the United States, kind of instigating, and also because of the embargo, there isn't enough food. And so the Cuban government will blame many problems on the United States. And likewise, the United States will respond by blaming everything on the communist government. And, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. But in a highly polarized environment, truth is one of the first casualties. So these signs are kind of a reminder of the politicization of Cuba. Politics is kind of everywhere. And yet, they feel almost like looking at telephone booths in New York City. They're still there, but they don't work anymore. They really have no function, and they are kind of relics from another era. And that definitely is. It feels like that's kind of going on in some places in Cuba, where you have these memories, these reminders of another era of fighting against the United States, and yet now the Cold War is over, and the world has shifted its focus away from Cuba. And so it seems not, I don't want to say obsolete or irrelevant, but there's kind of we're shifting away from one era, and there's a big question about what will the next era be like. And for instance, this young woman here, especially the young baby in that woman's arms, they were born, long after the revolution. They have no memory of what it was like before the revolution. And so it's very hard to transmit that kind of revolutionary spirit when you don't have any direct firsthand experience with the circumstances of the revolution from which it sprang. So you can imagine how tricky it is to, it's much easier to have a revolution, much harder to transmit that revolution onward into next generations without some kind of continuity or some kind of direct relationship to it. And I think it's, try as you might to use art or even writing or even, teaching about the revolution. It's very hard to truly, immerse someone in the circumstances that Che Guevara and Fidel and even Jose Marti were fighting against. So in a way, like the familiarity with U.S. imperialism couldn't be more, distant in this time period, because the United States isn't so belligerent or hostile towards Cuba like it was during the Cold War. Now, during the Bush years, as we'll see, 9/11, that swings the pendulum back away from increasing openness with Cuba, and kind of perpetuates the embargo until kind of more recent years. So we'll get there in a moment. So these are, reminders. Maybe some of these men could have been old enough. Maybe that lady was old enough to be alive during the revolution, or at least very young. Even Fidel and his brother here in the background are very young. So these are kind of a maybe bittersweet reminder of better moments of triumph. And now Cuba is sort of this country marooned by the world, adrift without a rudder and without a country to depend on. Remember, the history of Cuba is a history of depending on other countries. And now for the first time, Cuba is all alone, but it's all alone without any chance of really trading with other countries because of the U.S. embargo. So, obviously, finally being self-sufficient isn't really, I think, a goal. You can't really be self-sufficient as a country in a modern world, because we're so interdependent economically on everything from oil to food to electricity to internet and all kinds of basic stuff. So the feeling from these people here is sort of like, what's the future? And I think a lot of people today, even more so, really wonder, the idea of leaving Cuba, I think, becomes increasingly promising for people. And that's a very sad conclusion. It shows that the revolution didn't succeed after all your years of sacrifice and fighting, that there wasn't kind of a bright light at the end of the tunnel. So, and of course, then there could still be a bright light at the end of the tunnel. Just right now, we're kind of fully in the tunnel. And I think a lot of Cubans will just sort of choose to leave the United States, and that's what's going on right now. A lot of Cubans are leaving. So in contrast to that, you have the artists who we're going to look at today, who are kind of going back and forth. They're not taking these one-way trips out of Cuba. So before we get there, first, a little more context. Cuba gains a new lease on life when it allies with Hugo Chavez, not Che Guevara, Hugo Chavez, who is kind of someone who is both a champion of nationalism, but also that Bolivarian idea of a unified Latin America, especially against the imperialism of the United States. And that is certainly common ground that both of these men find. And both of them are very much kind of these militarized leaders, dictator-like leaders. And you can see how old Fidel is getting here. And eventually, by 2008, he will pass on power to his brother. Now, if you remember from last class, we briefly pointed out that Fidel, you weren't allowed to show him taller than anyone else or eating. I don't know if, yeah, I guess they're about the same height, so I guess this photo was okay. But that goes to show how kind of ridiculous, how focused on appearances the politics are in the country rather than focusing on substance. So even this showing Fidel eating is a big no-no. And of course, the Coca-Cola behind him, I think shows the irony and the satire going on in this period of uncertainty, and certainly questioning the legacy of Fidel. And I think this, especially using the fact that Che Guevara's body was returned to Cuba, as a chance to reflect on the legacy of Che Guevara. So as far as the context goes, the United States during the 90s was very much all about trying to aggravate things in Cuba to get Cubans to rise up against Fidel Castro. But because Cuba reached out to Venezuela, to Hugo Chavez, and because Cuba shifted to more kind of, I guess, environmentally green agricultural policies, Cuba was able to remain politically viable without any kind of internal struggle. And by 2001, by the Bush years, the Bush administration decides not to try to improve relations with Cuba and tightens restrictions on the U.S. embargo. And the U.S. is mainly focused on fighting the war in terror after 9/11. So Cuba at this point is really not at all the darling of the communist world, because there really isn't the same kind of communism that there was during the Cold War now that the Soviet Union is gone. So this is a very big change from the Cold War era that we were kind of looking at up until last class. Now we're in this sort of uncertain period after the Cold War. The United States is focused on the war on terror and very much distracted from Cuba. And so Cuba will reach out to Hugo Chavez, and that will keep Cuba afloat economically for about, I'd say, another maybe decade. But as we know, the history of Cuba, depending on other countries, is a temporary fix, but certainly not a long-term fix. But you can't really have a long-term fix unless you get rid of the U.S. embargo. And getting rid of the U.S. embargo probably means holding elections, and the people in government in Cuba might not want to let go of power. And letting go of power isn't just a matter of not being a party official, but more deeply, the Cuban government and the military is very involved in the economy, whether it means building hotels or owning all the agricultural land. So holding open elections means revealing possibly a lot of corruption going on in the country. And so in a place where there's a lot of corruption, you're going to see very little interest in changing the status quo. And I think probably today, with Fidel gone, there's probably more corruption than ever, because Fidel was probably and his brother were the only people with the power and kind of political authority to stave off rampant corruption. And I certainly would assume that there's probably quite a bit of corruption in Cuba, just like there is in any country, the United States, whenever you have people who are unscrupulous, or there's an opportunity to make money at the expense of the country. But certainly this is a time where the United States is looking very bad as a country. For a very brief period after 9/11, the United States was a very was loved by the world. We were seen as a victim, a target of terrorism, but that very quickly shifted to the United States once again being a pariah of the world because images like that, like this, were shown of the horrible treatment of prisoners taken during the Iraq War. And, these are Muslim prisoners who were humiliated by US forces. And this really set a tone about the United States being an imperialist power that really doesn't care about Muslims. And, we had a lot of prisoners in Guantanamo from this war on terror. And so that is one way the Cuba does kind of continue to be a thorn in the side of the United States and vice versa, because we use Guantanamo, the base in Santiago, as a place to put prisoners from the war on terror. And of course, imagine you're a country that has your own values and, I guess, reputation, and then another country is putting political prisoners inside of a prison in a naval base in a country that you in a naval base that you don't even want in your country. That's kind of that must be aggravating. But also, Cuba, I think, uses this chance to talk badly about the United States because it sees, these kinds of images are only going to fuel the fire of hatred against the United States and Cuba. So let's get back to now the commercialization of the art scene is really part of this effort to rise up out of the despair, economic despair of the special period. Remember, the Bolsero crisis, people fleeing Cuba to seek a better life. Well, one way the Cuban government improves the economy, besides reaching out to Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, is by investing in tourism. And the art scene in Cuba, the art world, really becomes a very hot location, hot destination for buying art, and continues to be so today. And I think the reasons for that are really because people want to know what's art, what are artists making in Cuba? What is art like in Cuba? How is it distinct from art in other parts of the world? And especially because I think people assume that the artists in Cuba are going to be reacting to this either totalitarian environment or just kind of offering a different kind of flavor of art than anything else you see in other parts of the world. And so there's a certain allure, a fascination, and maybe even a mystery because Cuba is isolated politically, economically. So Cuba kind of becomes a darling of the art world in the 1990s. And the artists kind of rise to the challenge and I think also kind of rise to the moment to criticize and comment on Cuba as it's transforming before their eyes. And the transformation isn't just let's make more art. Let's offer Cuban art as a relevant part of the art world, but also the sort of that prostitution, that soullessness that comes from capitalism and commercialization. And I think you can appreciate some of the work here is kind of commenting on the art world here, like travel to Cuba and kind of commodification of Cuba, cultural commodification. Um, I think especially here, kind of well, you tell me, what do you think? Do you see have we seen this before? Do you remember her from earlier in the semester? There she is. So how does this change? This is a painting we wrote about or talked about of a woman who's probably still a slave, taking a moment of looking at herself wearing the mistress's clothing in the vanity. So what's the artist Pedro Alvarez Castillo doing here? Cinderella's made with bluebirds. What could this possibly be saying about, Cuba, and or is there a political commentary here?
I guess it's trying to say it's like rags to riches in a way, since it's a Cinderella.
Oh, right. Good, good. Yeah, maybe tell everyone who maybe some of us might not know the story. Maybe everyone does, but just
Uh,
which is kind of a
uh,
young girl who's like becomes wealthy.
uh, young girl who's usually pushed aside later on. Yeah, fairy godmother comes along, turns her to a more fashionable princess, makes her well presented, and later on, uh, gets the prince and whatnot. So it could be a commentary on on Cuba's possible future.
Yeah, so it's it's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition of Disneyland, like Disney princess with Cuba, and I think it kind of reminds you of the proximity to Florida, and I think perhaps like the Disneyfication. If you think about, Florida is a place where they thought the fountain of youth was Ponce de Leon, and people come to Florida to retire. People come to Florida to go to Disneyland, right? People come to Florida to flip houses. So there is a kind of Florida is kind of like Cuba, and it's like a tropical destination, a paradise. And maybe that's what they're kind of getting at here, that Cuba will become like Florida, another kind of Disneyland. And, it's hard not to feel like the artist is kind of offering kind of an ironic, this isn't, this is like a a condescending look at perhaps realities, kind of treating it like a fairy tale or maybe a fantasy. Yeah, yeah, I think it's mainly a commentary on capitalism for me, at least. That's got someone who's a slave. Now, notice she's not looking now the vanities over here, on a little closer, perhaps. But yeah, there's something almost, think about a slave dressing up in, her master's clothing to have a moment of kind of autonomy or self-evaluation or kind of even rebelling against the status quo. Well, here, you might consider, is that kind of a parallel to, what's going on with, or do Cubans perhaps have this dream of like a capitalist dream, a commercial dream, like maybe this is about the soul of Cuba, being kind of the equivalent to someone, a slave that's imagining themselves, free for a moment, but really they're just sort of still a slave, still sweeping. And yeah, I think it for me, when I think of Disney, I think of like, fairy tales and, very kind of cartoon view of the world. But I think there's probably more going on to this than just that. I feel like I'm kind of just scratching the surface. Anyone else? And maybe the specific scene in Cinderella, perhaps. Cinderella literally comes from the cinder is a girl who I think attends to the fireplace. So it's like an Italian word for the girl who's like a low status person whose only job is to deal with the dirty work of embers. So I think that seems like a fitting kind of analogy to perhaps someone who's low status. But I wonder if, is this commenting? I don't think this is necessarily commenting on Cuban society or the Cuban government so much as maybe the commercialization of the art scene. Here's another example by the same artist. So maybe this, what we do notice is he's drawing from the history of art from Cuba. So it's a very interesting example of mining, the cultural mining for kind of relevance, and that makes it a little safer. If you're taking something that's already art history and you're using that to comment on the present day, that's a very clever strategy to avoid, biting the hand that feeds you, because you're saying, well, this is already art history. All I'm doing is kind of juxtaposing it. So what about here? Is this similar to what we just saw? Here's Cinderella's 53 Skylark. So there does seem to be a continuity with this idea of Cinderella and the fairy tale. So I think that, what Raymond was saying, or Ed, I can't remember who was saying that, Raymond, that Cinderella might be kind of the equivalent of someone having this dream, but it's like a Disneyland kind of dream. Now, people go to Cuba in the 1990s, and even today they comment on the 1957 Chevys, and the cars look like something in a time capsule. So that's part of the kind of curiosity of Cuba. And so there could be the artist commenting on Cuba just being a curiosity, for tourists. And that's all that the art world is kind of doing, is preserving the sense of maintaining this idea of being a curiosity. Now, the figures we see there on the right, that was like that was like I don't know if you call it Guajiro, but we've seen a painting similar to that, the guy with the two dogs. That's quite all right, right? Quite all right. But certainly like the Disneyfication of Cuba, I'd say is the best way of, that's it for now, at least a placeholder way of describing what we see here, unless anyone else has any comments. It certainly is a fun, kind of, and even I think very recognizable thing for us living in Florida. Any other comments? Maybe someone was paying for their food. And here, I think we saw this art earlier this semester briefly. So yeah, I think the commodification of Cuba, and that I think you could certainly say that's true in any places where there's capitalism. Very quickly, if you become a famous artist, you almost become a commodity, and it's hard to have your soul intact once you become a commodity. And so I think that's probably what's going on. Once capitalism enters Cuba, or once you have, the world of needing to make money for tourism, then you kind of go back to that cha-cha-cha world that with Fredo Lam was trying to fight against, reducing Cuba to, it's a very superficial veneer, and at the expense of the sort of deep inner concerns of people maybe on the inside rather than on the outside. And I think the idea of an enema, which is the name of this group, that's, performance art is a little harder to teach than visual art. And there's a rich history of performance art well into the 1990s, starting in the 1980s, as we saw with the likes of Lexus Novoa. And we saw that the theme of excrement was a big part of the 1990s. Angel Delgado uh, defecated on the Granma. And I think the theme of, you know, mierda or crap or vomit or an enema, was is kind of a comment on the art scene, on the art world. The art world is crap and it needs kind of an enema to kind of clean itself. But you could also see that as a analogy for the Cuban, Cuban society as a whole, like it needs some kind of an enema, which is like a cleaning the colon. So, performance continues to be very relevant well into the 90s. And I think, also because it is a sort of perhaps less incendiary, less likely to get you in prison, especially if you work together with many people. But we're going to focus mainly on the visual arts, and I think you could see kind of the commodification and even the kind of the fascination with Cuba as a curiosity here in the artwork, that kind of a relic from the era of the United States having Shell Oil Company in Cuba, and I think transforming that, but it's still kind of like an object that is an object from the Cold War, perhaps. And here, of course, the art painting we saw earlier, very much kind of commenting on the art world in Cuba becoming a kind of a world of prostitution. So this artist, I think, is the beginning or a good chance to think about this idea, this other theme of artists not leaving Cuba permanently. So you can see from his pedigree or from his accomplishments that he isn't someone who left Cuba, but rather spent a lot of time in the United States teaching at Stanford. I think I met him around this time. I don't think I met him at Stanford, but I met Tonell in Havana. And he's a very interesting guy and is someone who I think is the bellwether of this new wave of artists who live in Cuba, but spend much time abroad and do so with the full support of the Cuban government, which by now understands that the art, it can only benefit from having more art shared with people around the world. And I think the artists likewise understand that as long as you don't burn your bridges, you can really benefit from having this really unique privilege to travel from Cuba and return without, consequences. And that's very rare. Most Cubans, unless you're a doctor, don't or maybe an airplane pilot, you don't really have the chance to travel or to leave Cuba. And most Cubans leave permanently. So that's really exceptional. That's why I say that these artists are almost like a Che Guevara, cultural Che Guevara, because they're the new ambassadors of the Cuban Revolution, even if it's not they're not kind of, they're not deliberately trying to be ambassadors. They are kind of, unspoken ambassadors of the Cuban Revolution, and, very much, I guess, examples of the successes of the Cuban Revolution. And those successes are, it's hard to have success when your economy is going south. And that means, school teachers get paid less, healthcare crumbles, infrastructure crumbles. So a lot of the successes of the revolution, are declining or diminishing or gone altogether just because of the deteriorating condition in Cuba. So, I think his art very much is kind of commenting on the same theme of kind of cleansing, using maybe the body, cleaning the body, vomiting as, maybe comment on the art world. But you also notice he collaborated with Robert Rauschenberg. I think they designed a T-shirt together, he and Robert Rauschenberg. So somewhere around Cuba, there could be a T-shirt designed by Robert Rauschenberg and Tonell floating around. And Gosh, I hope someone has that and can preserve it. That would be a really neat thing to see. So he has, I think this comment by Tonell is really kind of fitting encapsulation of this era. It says many artists faced commercial demands based on distorted perceptions of what Cuba is and what Cuban art should be. In fact, the market is aimed at tourists from well-informed, wealthy consumers to creators of major museums to European visitors who buy t-shirts of Che Guevara and sip their mojitos as they remember May 1968. So I think he's being totally tongue-in-cheek here, and he's kind of saying, he's contradicting himself in the same statement, and I think that's kind of the whole point. It's kind of like the equivalent to me of what you see in the art world after World War One. World War One was a reckoning on the value of technology. Before World War One, people didn't understand that if you industrialize weaponry, you're gonna like magnify the ability to kill people by a billion. And before the World War One, a lot of people thought, well, technology is going to save us all. Well, in fact, technology will probably destroy us all, they learned. And so after World War One, the art world really is, and it goes into a state of satire and kind of this is where you get Duchamp and other artists kind of questioning the art world, the relevance, or even the kind of soul of the art world. That's when people, putting the mustache on the Mona Lisa. So satire is a way to respond to, I think, an era of great disappointment or losing faith in the government, losing faith in institutions. And I think that's what's going on in this time period with this declining faith in the revolution, or even the uncertainty about the future. And into this vacuum void come all these tourists who have their own ideas of Cuba, just like all of us kind of have our own interest in Cuba. And when you finally get to Cuba, you have to kind of filter your presumptions about the revolution with the realities of the revolution. And so these artists or these people coming to Cuba, whether they're creators of museums to, well-informed, wealthy consumers, they all, I think, likewise bring to Cuba their own expectations. And I think the artists are kind of there either accommodating those expectations or blowing those expectations up, but it's up to each artist to kind of figure out where they are. And of course, the Cuban government has their own agenda, which is to get as many of these people coming to Cuba as possible, because otherwise the Cuban economy will continue to falter. And I think today, right now, Cuba, I think 10% of the Cuban economy is tourism, which is, a lot, but you might think it would be more. And I think it really depends on a lot of factors. But you can't really have tourism unless you have reliable electricity. And I think today more than ever, people demand internet. And so I think Cuba is a great place to go if you want to get away from the 21st century. But most people still want to be in the 21st century when they go travel to other countries. So right now, we'll talk more about contemporary Cuba next class. So Tonell, I really like his work. He does some really fun, kind of ironic satire about the situation in Cuba. But on the other extreme, a more kind of formal beauty. And I think very well known, those carpinteros, which means carpenters, do this wonderful kind of collaboration. And I think one thing you should think about as we look at these artists, and including these carpinteros, is remember back in the 1970s, 1980s, the artists were trained by the Cuban government. The question might be, well, is their art authentically Cuban? Like, does their art need to look like it's from Cuba for it to have a certain kind of innate value? And certainly, I think from the Cuban government's perspective, having trained these artists, that they're going to want the art to be something homespun, something that comes from within Cuba, not like taking some style from outside of Cuba, like we saw with the photorealism. So I think that's something you should think about as we look at these different works. Are they continuing that strategy, or at least the goal of making art that is somehow recognizably Cuban, as in it doesn't kind of just borrow from imported fashions from abroad? And I think these certainly do pass that standard. And they're kind of continuing what we saw in the 1980s, which is drawing perhaps from very culturally recognizable parts of Cuban society here. Cigar boxes are kind of one point of inspiration for their art. But I personally really love these very elaborate creations, these sculptures they make, which earn them a lot of recognition and attention abroad. I think partly from the masterful, skillful kind of quality of their creation, but also the sort of innovation and imagination they bring to their work. And I think what I just said is a great way to describe all of the Cuban art world, the art scene. There's something really wonderfully imaginative about Cuban art. Unlike many countries, even the United States, I think a lot of artists tend to go for novelty's sake or flashy stuff. Whereas I think Cuba, you still have this real sense of skill and quality and dedication. And also, you don't have the distractions of maybe the internet and the distractions of capitalism to, maybe perhaps make you less likely to collaborate or to indulge in more kind of formal pursuits. But I personally love these works. They kind of remind me of some of the artists we've seen, the sculptor, Elso perhaps, and they've earned quite a bit of international reputation for their work, including here. And the biennial is the Havana Biennial, and the biennials around the world, Vienna particularly, they're a place to showcase artists' work, and that cross-pollination from going abroad and contributing and participating in these big international art events will only enrich the Cuban artists. And I think you could see how their artwork, especially when we get the Carpinteros, you can almost feel like it's part of this kind of global art world, very sophisticated and kind of with a wide lens that's focusing on globalization rather than just regional interest or local interest. So it's almost as if these artists have a real like big picture view of the world and the changes. And I think you see that with Los Carpinteros. And I think the question will be, does that wider lens come at the expense of addressing local Cuban concerns and addressing, the realities in Cuba? What do you think is going on? So is there a meaning to be taken? Could you see any social commentary on something like this? Like a sofa with what is that? A stove? Could this be a comment on, could you read any like, is this a political work of art? I'll let you guys think about this one for a moment. I don't think you have to say I don't think you need it to be. I think you can appreciate this just for its clever kind of juxtaposition of things. But could there be an underlying political commentary on the world or on Cuba today? And or if you saw this, and I didn't say this was by Cuban artists, would you think, oh, this could be a work by Cuban artists?
No, it kind of it looks to me like being in the hot seat, or maybe it's trying to say stop sitting around doing nothing, get up and do something. So it's kind of like preventing you from sitting or you'll get burned. Like
That's great.
it's I don't know what's that saying is there's a
Yeah, I think
saying about like being stationary is bad or something. I don't know.
idleness, idle. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's
idleness.
like biblical.
Idleness breeds something. I don't remember.
Yeah, that breeds bad stuff. I know
Yeah.
what you're talking about. Yeah, no, that's great. I never thought about this. The idea of like get off your butt. It's a great invention. If you're someone prone to idleness, all you need to buy one of the Carpinteros sofas, and that problem will be solved. Just turn up the dial, and you will get back to work. And yeah, I love that. And I think one hope thing I've been trying to make, point I've been trying to make throughout the semester is, yeah, even though something might not seem overtly political, that doesn't mean you can't expand your definition of political to include something like, just your individual world is political, personal is political. So you could see this certainly as like a way of addressing politics, indirectly in a more personal way, familiar way. And I like what Jay says, makes me think about yeah. So I grew up in an era where you have to get up and change the station. My sister and I would fight about who had to stand up, and you would just end up sitting down all day and you'd watch TV for like 2 hours and you'd go out and play. Now it's a little different when you have the internet, but I think the idea is true too today. Now it's called screen time. Screen time, it's going to melt your eyeballs or something. So, I think there could be political commentary here, but I think more importantly, there's something just fun and playful and really kind of timeless. And, there's a universal appeal to this artwork, because I think anyone in the world really, whether you're rich or poor, you're going to look at this and kind of be amused, because it's like combining, it's almost like Salvador Dali or Duchamp combining two things, like a lobster telephone. It's very like what would you call it, conceptual, but also maybe surreal and very familiar. But I think I agree with your first point, Ed, that it's or Raymond, I can't, or Ed, whoever said it, that yeah, it's not really like recognizably Cuban, unless perhaps you think of the couch as maybe something. If in Cuba you see this kind of couch, but I think you could very easily conclude that there's nothing distinctly Cuban about this. And I think you could look at that and say, well, that's a good thing, because maybe Cubans no longer have to have like a palm tree, or what we think about the things you think of Cuba, like a red star or like a Che Guevara. Now artists are free to tackle art the way you would in the United States without feeling an obligation to honor what capitalism. Like you wouldn't, as an artist in the United States, say, oh, my art needs to look like it's from the United States. But you can understand how there is pressure to be like that if you're in a country with a lot of tourism, a lot of tourists. Probably if you're buying art in Cuba, you might not buy a couch that's with flames on top of it, because maybe one, it's going to be really hard, an importing nightmare, an exporting nightmare, but also that's a different kind of concern. Cuban tourists want something that's like a memory, a keepsake from Cuba. But artists like these are really looking probably for institutions like museums who want to collect Cuban art, and they're not necessarily going to be looking for like a palm tree or whatever. At least some of them aren't, I hope. But they're looking for very collectible art. And so I think the value of something like this is you've got museums who know that a lot of skill is going to have a lot of value, but also there's a timeless appeal to this. And I think the other question would be then, does that mean there's no value to this as in it's from Cuba? But I think in that case, it's the value wouldn't come from it looking like it's from Cuba so much as just knowing that these artists work in Cuba and that's part of their story. And these artists are very successful. They've gone around the world. I think now they don't work as a team together, they don't collaborate, but this ability to travel, and I think really shows, has really influenced their art and made it, and brought it to a whole new level of sophistication. And they're really benefiting from this time of being able to leave Cuba and travel back and forth. And I think here, though, you could see they're still kind of commenting on Cuba, perhaps. A lighthouse is a big part of Cuba being an island. And then a lighthouse that's fallen down does seem like it's a little closer to political commentary than perhaps the sofa. But of course, you could see the sofa as like a comment on laziness, like you said. So perhaps maybe it's just a reminder to other artists, like to not sit down, to get off your butt and make art. This looks a little closer to something you might recognize in Cuba, with a really interesting twist. If you ever go to Havana, you will see this famous icon of Che Guevara on the side of the building, visible from the Revolutionary Plaza. So this is very much like a political lighthouse here of Che Guevara, with the star as like a beacon of communism. And in this case, the artists are taking everyday people. You notice it says it's not Che, it's Cachita. So it's really neat for me to see these artists now taking this kind of language of idolizing the famous people of the revolution and using it to honor the everyday people. And so you could see some examples of them kind of transforming everyday Cubans into Che Guevara. You might notice they're all pretty old. So I think it's probably a comment on these people having been alive earlier in the revolution, and certainly a more direct comment on Cuba. You would say this has one foot firmly in Cuba, and perhaps you might, but then perhaps you might say, well, is this critical of the government? And I think if anything, this is only honoring the people of Cuba without anything provocative that's going to get them in trouble. I love the work by Los Carpinteros, partly because they don't feel like they need to kind of spoon feed you anything overtly Cuban. It's like they're just sort of free to make art that is sort of just what they want to make as artists. And I think that's a really wonderful place to reach, where you no longer have to accommodate tourists. But I think they're also bringing all those skill and all that training from the Cuban Revolution, from Cuba. They're bringing that training and to work here for them. And so, again, it goes back to the question, if the Carpinteros end up deciding to leave Cuba permanently, well, that's sort of like Cuba has got what you might call brain drain. When people leave the country, you're have a net loss from of that investment in them. So, it's not just the personal question of leaving your homeland behind, but also the government not wanting to lose all these highly trained people that they have invested in. And so there could be another layer of meaning, of course, to a nail that's been bent. These nails look a little longer than normal, much bigger than normal. Yeah, could you see any symbolism to a bent nail? It's not just bent like it's been bent by a hammer, like mishammered, so much as like they are almost figurative. Like for me, they're like figures that are contorted and maybe emotional nails. What do you think about these? They look really big, right? Big nails that are kind of twisted. I love the human quality that they're like expressive, uh and I wonder if there's almost like a hint of provocation here. Being rusted perhaps is similar to being old and worthless. A nail that's bent and rusted is kind of worthless. So kind of taking something that's worthless and saying it, oh no, in fact, it has a lot of value. That's that. There's something there. There's a lot more than meets the eye here. Anyone have any comments on these nails? See, someone says, yeah, okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, lost their use. Yeah, I think, yeah, I do think there is probably some kind of very clever, comment on, the changing times here, whether the rust or the uselessness. Um, yeah, irreversible. Yeah, when once you hammer a nail, as if you've ever hammered a nail, and it gets bent, there's not much, not much more you can do with it. But interestingly, it feels like maybe these nails aren't necessarily bent because of the hammer. You could see, like, what's the hammer? Well, the hammer could be the hammer of socialism, the hammer and the sickle. So perhaps these represent Cuban people who've been bent and warped as they try to, be useful tools of the revolution. Um, and maybe just Cuba sort of permanently bent out of shape. But I love it when artists take like an everyday object, make it bigger. Jeff Koons often does this, but Jeff Koons does it without this kind of skill, or maybe he does it with skill, but he's often kind of just doing it to kind of celebrate himself. Jeff Koons is very much kind of a celebrity artist, whereas these artists, I think, are more commenting on society, and especially people maybe being bent. I think that's why they're so big and they're so expressive, like a head and a foot. The pointy part of the nail is the foot. The head is like the top. So I don't know. Perhaps that's what's going on. But I love the work by Los Carpinteros. Here, I'll show you this little example of Abel Barroso. We're still kind of in the earlier period. We haven't quite gotten to contemporary world yet. I'll show you an example. Here is one of his cigar boxes that he transformed into kind of a moving picture. I have it sped up a little bit just so you can see it in more quick time. You can see the commercialization of Cuba, the cigars, and very clever, skillful use of carpentry. And I think you'll find that in Cuba something different than a lot of artists in the United States. Not all, of course, very big country with a lot of range in this country. But because Cuba is so small, you might not expect artists to be so skilled and trained. And yet that really comes from having really wonderful investment in education in Cuba. And I think you can really see how these artists have a lot of a lot of imagination. So let's go back to our lecture here. And you could see commenting on maybe identity as a part of state control, your name, your nationality. We saw a lot of traveling last time, more traveling across the ocean. So here it's kind of like identity is playing with identity, but playing almost kind of juxtaposing wood with modern identity. It's kind of like those nails or other things we've seen with kind of combining things, Disney with paintings from the late 1800s. Here's like the digital with cigar boxes. Very clever, very imaginative. And one of my favorite artists, William Perez, now, born in 1965, so we're not quite at the millennials yet. Millennials are usually like around 1978, 1980, but really love his sculpture. And Yeah, I think he's someone, if you ever go to Cuba, I'll connect you to him. He does some really amazing kind of conceptual work. Here he's kind of commenting, I think, on Che Guevara, like we've seen with others, the return of Che Guevara's body. This is by William Perez. And, reflecting on Che as maybe a symbol of, the future, or the, symbol of, the romantic symbol of Cuba. And he's like a martyr for Cuban society, Jesus-like figure. And so, kind of a mirror of Cubans having to kind of sacrifice on behalf of the revolution. I'm not going to spend too much time on a lot of these. I just want to get through a few so you can have more choices to consider for your final paper, and also just show you the range of different things. You might have noticed in the 1980s, there weren't many female artists. By the 1990s, that's quite the uh, uh, totally different. And in fact, I'd say it's probably even male, female. So very machismo from the 1970s, it's given way to a very kind of more inclusive world. And I met Rocio Garcia. Her paintings are really cool and quirky, and kind of all about like nightlife and the darkness of like clandestine things that happen at night versus during the daytime. And that's, a nice contribution to what we've been talking about, because, you think about the revolution at night versus a revolution during the day, do politics kind of turn off at night when the sun goes down, and when the sun comes back up, politics begins again. So there's something really neat about examining nighttime as like the personal versus the political, the private versus the public, within the revolution, outside the revolution, shining a light as kind of like the revolution, the personal world, the private world. Now, of course, the ocean continues to be a big part of Cuban imagination, an escape. But as I've mentioned, these artists by this era understand that if you leave Cuba permanently, you're going to have burnt your boats, and you're going to have to, struggle against the art world in the United States, being a Cuban artist, but not being a Cuban artist still living in Cuba. And sadly, if you leave Cuba as an artist, you're not perhaps as collectible. Perhaps they're not going to say, oh, you're no longer a Cuban artist. Now you're a Cuban American artist, right? And so, I mean, that goes to show the kind of the way tourism and the art world kind of, reduces you to, very kind of silly kind of, you know, biographer, silly kind of characteristics or national identity that, hopefully your art transcends that. But, even so, you might get pushed back down to kind of some kind of lowest common denominator. And I love the art by these two sisters here, because it does feel recognizably Cuban. There's something like Santeria, or even it's recognizably Cuban because it's referencing back to other works of art, perhaps from the history of Cuba. Um, Perhaps maybe even a little Ana Mendieta here, with just the use of maybe natural like sand or something in the background, sculpting with sand. But more importantly, this idea of a two-way journey. So, the art, people go to Cuba, we talked about the 57 Chevys, the cars in Cuba are almost a symbol of Cuba's uniqueness. The fact that there's still functioning cars for the 1950s. And the reason why that is because the United States stopped exporting cars to Cuba after the revolution. So Cubans still drive around these old cars because they're not importing any new cars. So that's one of those exceptional things you see in Cuba, and becomes a symbol of Cuba as a curiosity. And so these artists are using that symbol, and I think showing you in this case, that, and I don't know if she's intentionally saying, you want to go have a two-way trip, de ida y vuelta, return trip to Cuba. But I think you can kind of fit that into what we're talking about with the idea of you don't leave Cuba permanently. You want to have a way to come back, because then you'll benefit as an artist from being able to go and study or travel to the United States, travel in China. And that really is the reality with Cuban artists today, that we'll see after the break, that they all are constantly traveling around the world, as part of art exhibits, or as part of biennials, or as permanent collections in museums. And so they really have a unique privileged status in Cuba of being able to travel and to leave Cuba and come back, and make money by selling your art abroad. And, I don't want to get into details. Of course, the Cuban government, I'm sure, has some kind of arrangement with any art sale when you sell art abroad. And that will only probably enhance your status, economic status in Cuba. And, for instance, people say that if someone's working as a maid in a hotel or a housekeeper in a hotel in Cuba, a tourist hotel, they're going to make in tips what a Cuban doctor can make in a whole month. So basically, even though you're a housekeeper, you're making more money than a doctor in Cuba who spent, many years in medical school. And that must be really what would be the word? Hard to, reconcile with your time spent in medical school. And you can understand why a doctor in Cuba might just decide, to heck with it. I'm just going to go to the United States and practice medicine because, housekeeper at a hotel is going to make more money than a doctor can, saving lives, which is not to, diminish housekeeping at all. But I think that goes to show, likewise, with artists who can travel and leave Cuba and come back and make money selling their art abroad, they're going to have probably a lot more opportunities than if they leave Cuba. And so, oh yeah, and yeah, so Raymond, yeah, someone, you mean like your mother is a doctor? Yeah, imagine if your mother was trained to be a doctor in Cuba, yeah, what can you do, as a doctor, you want to save lives, you want to, be recognized for your work and having a viable career, and you don't want to starve to death. And a lot of people in Cuba are literally not getting enough food. So we're kind of going back to the special periods, sadly, today. So as you hopefully appreciate now, as we, before we take a break and look at the next period of artists who are more the millennials, that artists in Cuba today, the ones who are really kind of successful are ones who are traveling around the world with probably with a home in Cuba, but also a lot of friends and contacts abroad. And to their credit, these artists, I think, have really stepped up and offered work that's really relevant and viable and takes advantage of Cuba's unique position as a kind of vocal opponent of capitalism and colonialism. So we'll see after the break, these artists, I think, really, again, continue this tradition of Cuban artists just having really wonderful imagination and skill and quality that continue to make, I think, Cuban art very collectible and very worthy of, the increasingly global art world. The question will be whether that continues after the death of Fidel and into the future with such an economic uncertainty. So we'll look at those artists after the break and pick up on those questions after the break. So we saw Mabel Poblet's work earlier, the first painting we saw. You might notice from the write-up here that she apprenticed in a workshop by artist Tanya Bruguera, whose work we've seen, and who connects Mabel Poblet to the legacy of Ana Mendieta, because Tanya Bruguera certainly is someone who we've seen honor the legacy of Ana Mendieta here. We'll see it in a moment. We'll get ahead. Here it is. So we saw this. So I think you could certainly see Mabel Poblet as someone who is somewhat in the kind of maybe in the legacy of Ana Mendieta, or legacy as an artist working in and outside of Cuba as a Cuban artist, female Cuban artist. So, this picture, I think now you have a little better context to understanding perhaps, the idea of a journey and taking a journey away from Cuba. And I think the fact that the plane is facing left kind of implies there's a return journey. So, when I look at this, I think of, Mabel Poblet growing up in millennial Cuba at a time when the Cuba's future is uncertain, especially because of the end of the Cold War and because all the kind of leaders of the revolution are fading into their twilight. And here she's coming of age in this time of uncertainty and taking advantage of the chance to leave Cuba. And I think that is a kind of reckoning with your identity as an artist. Are you, Cuban first? Are you, an artist first? And of course, your coming of age is part of this maturation of that question and answering that question of, who you are as a function of your society and your creativity, and of course, your inner world, and how art is a kind of reflection of that inner world. And I think you can see some of the raw materials of stuff that she's going to make moving forward, like the map, mapping out the body, which we've kind of seen with Ana Mendieta. And I think the idea of taking a journey and kind of understanding that a journey is both an outward journey and an inward journey, which is to say that when you travel, you move physically around to other places, but you kind of transform on the inside. And I don't think there's any direct connection to Robert Rauschenberg from her, or even inspiration, but I see a similarity, the use of silkscreen, compositing different photos and images together as kind of a collage of identity. But I much prefer Mabel Poblet's kind of style. One, because she's painting, but also because it has all the depth that you would expect from someone who actually grew up in the country she's talking about. Whereas Rauschenberg's imagery is sort of a superficial, touristy kind of view of Cuba from the outside, whereas I feel you can really feel the rich depth of Mabel's kind of similar approach to collaging different elements, but with a deep kind of heartfelt presence in her own country. And that idea of breaking the body down into component parts will be a big part of her work, especially moving into the present day. And I think you can appreciate some of the perhaps Ana Mendieta qualities to her work, kind of treating the body as a canvas, and maybe as a starting point for recognizing or recognition or familiarity, but then, breaking that down and kind of perhaps building it back up. So her mentor was Atana, but maybe not mentor, but someone who certainly attended a workshop with. So I think you could see that perhaps Mabel Poblet's training formation is in somewhat performance, somewhat kind of using the body as an expressive landscape, like we saw with Ana Mendieta here. And I think you can see that shift away from kind of that first painting we saw into kind of breaking down some of those elements. You still almost have like a map, but now the body is kind of the landscape of the map. You have these kind of incremental steps that kind of document the journey. And of course, it feels like a very autobiographical journey, but perhaps the body as a sort of symbol of that coming of age. And, Ana Mendieta here is mapping out her body as kind of a way to perhaps, use the body as like a canvas, a blank canvas, exploration, but also a sense of identity. And I think there's something similar here, but perhaps more conceptual and more about, treating the body not necessarily as a physical thing, so much as representing the body as a symbol of identity and growing up, coming of age, taking a journey. And I love how mysterious it all is. I love that she's not spoon feeding you kind of what it's all about. She leaves it very much a mystery. In the same way our lives are kind of a mystery to ourselves. We have a sense of control over everything, but we also don't have any control over so much. And so I think I love that there's kind of a video game like quality here, leveling up, collecting all the pebbles, collecting all the dots, or even those as like footsteps, a sign of a journey, but there's no real necessary sense of destination. And you might notice on the far right, those little bubble spherical shapes transform into flowers. And so I love that idea that the dot or the sphere transforms into or blossoms into a flower. So that almost becomes a mirror image of the body transforming, a mirror of the body's germinating into something more beautiful, more vibrant, more complex. So these could also be seen as like sowing the seeds of the future generation. And they're almost like electrons flying against protons. So there's many layers of kind of visual references here, but I think you'll see in a moment that those dots and the flowers almost substitute or kind of merge with the body, and they become one and the same. So let's see kind of that evolution continue. Notice we're in 2006. So this is, she's about 20 years old here. This is near the age that near the time Fidel Castro leaves power and gives power to his brother. So certainly we're in in terms of the backdrop, Cuba is undergoing a lot of soul searching as far as its future. And I think at the ground level, artists like Mabel Poblet are also doing a lot of soul searching. She's 20 years old in 2006. And I think, imagine being 20 and, you guys are 20, a lot of you are 20s. I had to imagine it. And you kind of have a lot of, why would you stay in one place where you're not, where your talents aren't being fully, appreciated? Well, I think in her case, Cuba does kind of give a lot of fuel to her nourishing her talents. And I think you see that here, but also as she continues to benefit from traveling abroad and I think getting exposed to art from around the world, her artwork only continues to become more kind of idiosyncratic and kind of wonderful. For instance, stuff like this is a big break from the work we just saw. These kinds of materials you probably can't acquire in Cuba. So certainly the ability to obtain materials for your art is something you can do if you're able to leave Cuba and make contacts abroad. And this is the kind of work she was making when I first met her around the year 2011. But also in other cases, her body and her face or portraiture blended with these materials. And they eventually kind of reach this level of origami. This is the most recent stuff she's been making, where it looks like those little dots and spheres have transformed completely into origami. And the origami are all kind of like pixels, the equivalent of pixels that together compose an image. And I think the image has a very eerie resemblance to some of the things we've seen with Ana Mendieta colors. And so I can see each of these, the dimension. Now we're almost like a pixel with volume, and yeah, it's almost like three different pixels in one because of the different kind of angles. It also has for me a reference to that little shape you make in grade school where it's on like a fortune telling device. But yeah, I think it's almost like reminds of like the fractured nature of identity. Um, each of your individual parts is like kind of own little microcosm. And, it's different when she has it arranged in this way, where every part is not necessarily contributing to an overall picture. Whereas in other cases, it looks like the kind of component parts form into a body. So I'm not sure, I need to kind of see more of her work and maybe see it in person. But certainly I'll be curious to see where she goes from here. And this is actually, there she is right there photographing her work, and she'll be exhibiting her work in a month in Florida. I'll make sure I email you guys about that, and I'll let you know if she ever comes to Tampa. She will be coming to Tampa actually one day for a talk, so I'll make sure I get in touch with you guys about that. So this artist is definitely like another example of like kind of art that really maybe doesn't even feel like it's from Cuba, except perhaps the reference to what you see in the back, this kind of Baroque like um, uh, kind of decorative quality of the architecture you'll see in some parts of Cuba. So here it's very much like an installation using plants and trees and birch and paper. And so, refreshingly, unorthodox and wonderful. You could see here the write-up says the physical constructed on two physical and metaphorical levels, closely related by the gesture of replanting a forest symbolically and physically. So it kind of almost feels like this conceptual art, kind of like Mabel Poblet, like treating a forest and replanting a forest as kind of a metaphor for your own kind of sowing the seeds of your own future, maybe as an artist, but also as a country. Reforestation is a loaded term. It kind of implies there was a period of devastation. But I think it's very like works in the realm of metaphor, and perhaps there's kind of political commentary here. But I think what's going on here is these artists are free from having to make art that's recognizably Cuban, and I think that's a great leap forward, and that kind of shows that they've moved past that kind of commercialization of the art scene, that sort of the tourist gaze, the gaze of the tourist, and now they're kind of just on par with all the artists around the world who are just sort of hopefully operating completely independently of any forces that might stifle their art or force them to kind of prostitute themselves to a tourist art market. So I think this is a really great sign. This art looks world class and very imaginative, and doesn't seem like it's kind of pandering to an art market, a tourist art market. So it looks like the art world of Cuba has moved past that initial phase of kind of prostitution to the tourism, and is really operating more on the level of like the biennials and museums and institutions. And if you remember from the 1970s, we saw this painting, and this was subject to some criticism because some people thought, this doesn't reflect any sort of homegrown Cuban style. There's nothing recognizably Cuban about it. And you could go either way here. You could say, well, that's a good thing, or that's a bad thing. And maybe in the 1970s, that might have been less of a good thing because Cuba didn't have all that many decades of artistic output that kind of showed that Cuba is unequal with the rest of the world. Whereas by the 21st century, perhaps now Cuban artists can have a wider lens and not be so kind of stuck to Cuba artistically. And I think that just goes to show how much we've shifted away from the 1970s, because Cuba has kind of now earned its place in the art world. And, you can see we're all looking at kind of artists who aren't maybe your age, but a little, the generation before, maybe roughly around my generation, maybe a little younger. And they continue to travel around the world. Mabel Poblet has work in Tampa with this gentleman here, Alex Hernandez, clearly, Ohio, Germany, Denmark. So this is what I mean by these artists are really benefiting from the ability to travel and to return to Cuba. And, that might mean having connections abroad, access to material. But I think in this case, he's really still commenting on the art world in Cuba and the transformation because of tourism, and very much commenting on the kind of history of Cuba as a paradise. And yeah, I really enjoy seeing a painter use painting to comment on social changes. Partly one, because we haven't seen too much painting from Cuba. Maybe we've seen some, but not recently. But also because it's a really great way to revitalize painting as relevance of painting. So what do you think he could be commenting on here? What can we get if we scratch the surface of this? What kind of underlying message could there be to a painting of lawn chairs? And where are the lawn chairs? Where are we located here? And by the way, I'll read the quote. It says, he explores concepts such as comfort, luxury, commodities, and prosperity, and how they are assumed in social ambits. His work reflects the Cuban dream of Miami, presented similarly to a movie set, as a way to comment on the isolation of Cubans and their lack of awareness of the current realities of American life. Right. So, people in Cuba probably have these ideas about the United States, just like people in the United States have their ideas about Cuba. And when you have all these tourists coming to Cuba, there's something almost you're out of step. The average Cuban can't go to the Havana Libre and enjoy themselves. They probably need to go with a tourist if they're even allowed there, period. So most Cubans don't have access to the tourist amenities in Cuba the way tourists do. But I think artists are, they don't necessarily go to the tourist attractions in Cuba, but they can kind of enjoy traveling away from Cuba more than the average Cuban can. So maybe this is an artist kind of reflecting on that kind of absurdity of reality in Cuba with, what might be called tourist apartheid, where tourists are kind of segregated from the rest of society. So what do you think? How does this painting reflect what that write-up says? Any of you guys have any comments on what he could be addressing here with the lawn chairs? I mean, not lawn chairs, but what would they call it? Poolside lounge chairs. Of course, there's no one in the chairs. Are we in the water? Are we supposed to be the people in the water? I don't know. What do you guys think? I presume that's Havana in the background. So we're on the rooftop of a hotel, and that's probably downtown Havana. And so we're on we're in the tourist enclave here. I mean, I don't see any symbolism necessary to the colors, but I do think maybe just the idea of painting, tourism might be just a way of commenting on tourist apartheid and maybe the luxury of tourism, and perhaps how they're like high up in heaven, removed from the rest of Cuba. And of course, the reference to the water. Now we see water, and as we remember from last class, water is a kind of moat that surrounds Cuba. It's a source of uh, a promising future, imagining leaving Cuba. So there could be more than meets the eye here. It might be more than a swimming pool. It might be a metaphorical kind of Caribbean surrounding Cuba. And so maybe the isolation of Cuba, um, or maybe subverting the idea of water being kind of a moat that isolates you from the rest of the world. Now the tourists just have kind of this pool, swimming pool, and water to them is just another leisure activity, and it doesn't represent anything dangerous. It's just a swimming pool. So, I think there's a lot more than meets the eye here. And the absence of tourists, imagine how different it would be if you actually had the tourist in the picture. Yeah, I agree. I hear that, Raymond. I like that idea that water is a symbol of the American dream, and in a way, making the water now just a swimming pool kind of trivializes that Cuban dream in a way, like almost like tourism in Cuba is something that almost by definition trivializes the whole Cuban Revolution. Because I think one argument for that is because we've kind of come full circle. The whole point of the Cuban Revolution was kind of to get away, or one part of it was to get away from that gangster mafia cha-cha-cha tourism that Wilfredo Lamb criticized and others criticized. So now we've kind of come full circle to these tourists who are enjoying Cuba, and really kind of removed from reality of Cuba. So, I guess that would be perhaps the point here. We've come full circle back to the situation prior to the revolution. Is that what's going on here too? I don't know. I mean, I think I like that his work is somewhat dreamy and beautiful. There's an almost Richard Diebenkorn like abstract quality to his work. I don't know if you know Richard Diebenkorn. He's a wonderful West Coast painter who did a lot of really blurring that line between abstract and representation. Does this look like Cuba? Are we in Cuba here? Does this look anything recognizably Cuban? You got to love how the pool, how abstract the reflection is, drippy and oozy. Um, yeah, I think it's a interesting question. Like, does it need to look Cuban, and or is this more just looking at like kind of the trappings of luxury, and yet there's almost like that reflective surface looks like the kind of underside of kind of oozing away, maybe the soullessness of wanting to have a life of luxury, and yet you're kind of in a bubble perhaps, kind of staring out at nature. You definitely don't feel as much Cuban reference here as you might in the previous painting, but it could be just the artist is commenting on tourism altogether. Yeah, I think the only reference here for me is that greenery. I agree, kind of maybe looking out at paradise, but it doesn't necessarily even look like a Cuban paradise as much as maybe like doesn't have palm trees or anything overtly tropical. So maybe he could just be kind of commenting on just global tourism, and it's hard not to kind of think about tourism where you're just kind of trying to enjoy paradise or luxury or leisure, and thinking about how and how the art world fits into that, either accommodating tourism or pandering to it, or reinforcing the idea of tourism, and just how tourism relates to art as altogether, collecting memories and keepsakes from a place. But I think the absence of any people really makes it more timeless and universal. Are you supposed to want to be in that chair? Are these kind of promotional tours pictures for tourism? And I think the fact that the pool just seems kind of like abstract, and I don't know, it's like kind of dreary. I think that kind of is some kind of expressionistic commentary on the vapidness or the soullessness of, removing yourself from the world as a kind of luxury moment. But also, it's hard. You can't help but think of, your typical Cuban doesn't have access to all these amenities you see in Cuba. It's not built for you as a Cuban. You're not supposed to go into the pool. You're not supposed to sit on the lounge chairs. And if you do, you'll probably get in trouble. So the idea that all these amenities are made for non-Cubans, I think reinforces that sense of Cuba is increasingly being sold off to foreign consumption rather than benefiting the average Cuban. I mean, imagine, in the United States, you can't just go to any hotel or any pool if you're not, I guess, a guest there. But I think you're not going to get in trouble from the government so much, just get trespassed. And I think, maybe that depends on the situation in Cuba, but it's something odd about, the idea that the average Cuban probably can't afford to spend a night in the hotel, and only a foreigner can. And I think that goes a little ways in kind of explaining what might be going on here with this artist. The time of day here, it's at sunset or sunrise, with a long shadow, so that implies twilight. So it's almost like that could be a reference to the fading years of the revolution. Um, like something here, this feels almost like a reference back to that woman sitting, wondering about the future in the age of the end of slavery and Cuba still not being an independent country. It's hard not to look at these chairs and kind of think back about, people luxuriously reclining in their villas. So in a way, we're kind of continuing this commentary on Cuba becoming more of a place economically defined by tourism, but from a perspective perhaps of someone who does benefit from being able to be almost like a tourist, traveling back and forth. Here, of course, the cruise ship goes both ways, but I think it's up to each artist to decide kind of what is their kind of duty to country, to their art, to their own, maybe even feeding their own family by selling art. And I think that's true for a lot of these artists, kind of, the future, will their future be in, starting a family outside of Cuba or starting a family in Cuba? And will they be able to continue to benefit from having one foot outside of Cuba and one foot inside of Cuba? Like I said, I don't know if that will last forever. Um, just because there might not be any as much artistic interest in Cuba for much longer from other parts of the world. And I doubt that. I think it will continue to be a place with a lot of fascination so long as Cuba continues to be like politically distinct from the rest of the world. But that goes to show the kind of contradiction that a lot of our interest in Cuba is because it is so unique. And it's that very uniqueness that also stifles Cubans, the sort of the status quo is kind of what has created this sort of fascination with Cuba. And so once you change the status quo, once Cuba becomes more capitalist, does that mean Cuba will no longer be a sort of artistic bellwether? And that might be the case. So kind of the any change in Cuba might also mean these artists lose that kind of privileged status as these sort of the voice of the marginalized country, perhaps the non-aligned nations, or even just the voice of people struggling in a communist society. So I think you could see kind of the ghost of Ana Mendieta perhaps continuing to haunt Cuba here. Certainly the figure, could be much more loaded and perhaps even potentially controversial in Cuba. Unless it's maybe the body of Fidel Castro, or maybe, or maybe different if it's the body of a revolutionary figure versus an everyday Cuban. But I really feel, I don't know, what do you guys think when you look at this work by Cervino? Let me show you a few more examples. Is there any kind of political commentary here? I'm just showing you Ana Mendieta, perhaps a source of inspiration here, but what do you think about her work? Could there be, we're now in 2012, so we're not, Fidel Castro hasn't died yet, but and probably still Cuba's benefiting from its dependence on Hugo Chavez and Venezuela. But that aside, forget the context. Like what is your kind of take on what these figures are doing? They're not wearing clothing, but I don't think they're very sexualized. And the clothing, the nudity probably is like vulnerability or just kind of in a raw state of humanity. You could see some reference to the Garden of Eden here. What do you think might be going on here? Very ambitious piece, right? And the figures don't necessarily seem to be individualized. Like, I don't think you're meant to say, oh, that's this person or that person, so much as maybe being stand-ins for society. Like, are these meant to be Cubans, or are these humans? Are these tourists? Are these tourists looking at Cuba? Like, do you get a sense that these are meant to be one kind of population of people? Yeah, that's the feeling that I get, Hannah. That's a great observation. Uh, that they feel kind of like lost. Yeah, like they don't, I think some more so than others, but the fact that they're all looking in different directions. Um, some of them are almost kind of maybe the guy on the left kind of hiding his body parts, but I don't think there's ever, it looks like almost children who don't know where to go. Like they're looking around different directions. They're looking up, they're looking down. And when you think of looking up, looking up to what, maybe a revolutionary icon or sculpture, are they looking up to the sky, to heaven? Um, I like the Adam and Eve thing because, they're nude, there's male and female, but there's many. So it's almost like they're multiplying. Um, but yeah, I think that being lost is, I think for me, the real heart and soul here. Is there, Hannah, anything about them being made out of clay versus being made out of, another material? Is there a reason why the artist chose to make them out of clay? Does that reinforce the idea of them being lost, or is it maybe that's just kind of the material they used because it was available? Yeah, the texture. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you think about like the human touch, the clay is kind of made by the hand. So there's something, about almost like creation, creating the first creation of human beings. And now once they're created, they're kind of lost. They don't know where to go, kind of like being expelled from the Garden of Eden. Once you're expelled from the Garden of Eden, you're lost. You don't know, you don't have God as your guide. So there could be, and I almost feel like I'm trying to make this more political than it could be, or maybe trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. But I could almost see this as like, you've lost your guide with, the aging of Fidel Castro, the revolution reaching, next generation. They're kind of lost because they've lost like the rudder, the anchor, the compass. And maybe eerily foreshadowing the death of Fidel Castro, the death of Hugo Chavez, perhaps as symbols of the death of the revolution. Yeah, so maybe made of sand and dirt. Yeah, Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve, they form. I'm assuming there's some, I can't remember from Genesis. I think God breathes the soul into man, like the soul is the last component. But you think of God. God didn't give birth to humanity. God is like an artist who creates a sculpture and then gives it artificial intelligence. So yeah, I almost feel like you could say maybe the clay is like people being molded by the revolution. Again, you don't have to see this as like political, but if you wanted to try to, you could maybe see this as all these figures have been molded by the revolution. These are all millennials who've been kind of molded. Literally, their education was paid for by the revolution. And maybe once you graduate from art school, it's sort of like you've been expelled from Eden, and now you have unlimited possibility. You can leave Cuba, you can stay in Cuba, but I think it's the idea is like, now you're free to, put on your whatever clothing you decide, you're going to put on revolutionary clothing and look like Che Guevara. Are you going to become a tourist? Are you, I think there's a sense of uncertainty. And, I think the question might be, are these, Cubans? And I think that probably is the case. There's missing some details like nipples and fingernails. Usually in sculpture, when you don't have nipples, it's often, you're not sexualizing the sculpture, just like Barbie doesn't have nipples because she's not meant to be a sexualized. So I think the artist is maybe clearly saying we're not sexualizing these nude figures, but maybe leaving them in a raw state, and vulnerable and uncertain. And certainly if you don't have anything on, it kind of like now you're no longer Cuban. You're no longer recognizably Cuban because you don't have any of the cultural printing on your body. So in a way, you're kind of free. You're liberated from your cultural identity. So there could be some of that going on as well. And of course, mud or dirt feels more real, more authentic. And we talked about the challenge of, oh, I hadn't seen that. I forgot the body's fallen down. Now that as a whole, and you got to wonder, are these the same figures? Now they've fallen down and are broken. So that's very dramatic, to go from, standing up to fallen and broken. That's definitely kind of a tragic kind of ending. And now, of course, it looks like the water is, I don't know if you can see that, there's water that almost seems to be like kind of causing the figures to disintegrate and collapse. And that almost could be a comment, of course, as we've seen with water being a source of danger for Cubans who are lost and want to seek some kind of hope and prosperity in the United States or elsewhere. And you might notice it looks like there's like the water could be falling from showers. So they're being showered by water. So kind of the water is kind of like rain, like disintegrating you, and the water will just wash you away and you become water. You just disintegrate into the water. Very powerful piece. Yeah, absolutely love this work. And, this is around the time when Hugo Chavez dies, which means Cuba loses its kind of dependence on Venezuelan oil. And once you don't have oil as a country, that means you don't have anything in this modern era, because we're just so dependent on oil as a source for electricity, a source for, transportation, growing food, and so many other things. And I think Alejandro Campin's work really, I think, tackles some of these themes that we're talking about, with Cuban society kind of falling apart everywhere, and this sort of idea of these kind of icons from the revolution, the infrastructure of the revolution falling apart, and these kind of propaganda becoming these empty billboards, and kind of showing the deterioration Cuba as a kind of a symbol for that, perhaps kind of deterioration of the revolution. And I think they're very powerful paintings, because they are so kind of maybe they're not showing you paradise, but they're kind of showing you the underbelly of paradise. Almost like now we're looking at the reflections in the water from that earlier artist we just saw, and that's the primary subject matter here. And I do think there's something recognizably Cuban here, at least in terms of, it looks like a kind of a nightmarish version of Cuba, but certainly there's some elements of kind of recognizably Cuban imagery, maybe not in this case as much as in others, but I think what he's doing is kind of showing you the kind of infrastructure of the revolution, these empty billboards, even the light fixture, like the transformation from this one light fixture to the next, maybe just shows, maybe the fact that Cuba is kind of subject to Soviet influence, U.S. influence, and really is a place with a lot of schizophrenia, cultural schizophrenia, but now without any kind of guiding iconography. Like an empty billboard is a very powerful, like lights shining on an empty billboard that's kind of deteriorating, is really a kind of a very powerful statement about like the soullessness of kind of the place where there used to be some clear propagandistic message from Fidel about the future. And it kind of feels like a throwback to what we saw from Glexis Novoa in the late 80s, with him commenting on the kind of obsolescence of revolutionary iconography, especially as the Soviet Union collapses and you see glasnost and perestroika. So I think the same kind of thing. And like I said before, we're kind of entering a period in Cuba that's very eerily and sadly reminiscent of the special period, because Cuba is in a very steep state of economic decline, very reminiscent to the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the big difference now that you no longer have Venezuela as a lifeline to Cuba. And so something like this, it says, what kind of mill, when we see the word mill, what do you think he's referring to? Or what do you think, what kind of mill are we talking about here? And of course, you think about a mill, all that we have left here is this ruin, this last standing component to the mill. And I think probably we're talking about a sugar mill, like a place where you're, processing sugar. And so in a way, if you remember, we've talked about the warping of Cuba by sugar. Sugar is a kind of heroin-like drug that you don't want to be dependent on. Well, this is kind of a bittersweet comment on the end of sugar. Cuba is not as fertile as it used to be. Sugar production has very much declined, and you could see that as a positive thing, but also, you could see it as a negative thing, if only because Cuba doesn't have some other economic lifeline to substitute sugar, and I don't think tourism is necessarily a better substitute. It's kind of almost the same thing, like this sweet this very sweet commodity, tourism, but ultimately not nutritious, not nourishing. So I think that's kind of perhaps commenting on Cuba falling apart. And this is almost like a reference to the Cold War. This looks like some kind of pillbox. I think this is actually in the United States, but I think it's more him commenting on the end of the Cold War. And it doesn't need to be in Cuba so much as anywhere in the world, because all around the world there are all these relics from the Cold War, these obsolete, buildings that are kind of completely useless and totally irrelevant, and yet are part of the landscape. And I think that is a perfect comment on things that you see in Cuba, the sort of irrelevant elements, kind of obsolete parts of the revolution that are still visible all around Cuba, and yet are just that. They're just relics from another era. Here is, I think, the source for that image here. So it's much more, I think these are very deeply political comments on kind of Cuba being marooned, Cuba being now, especially after the death of Fidel. And I think you could perhaps see this painting as a comment on the death of Fidel, in the sense that, Fidel, by the time of his death, is likewise someone who's reached a level of kind of irrelevance or obsolescence, to the point where he just hands off power to his brother, who continues to rule Cuba for a little while longer. But that doesn't mean that he has, that there's now a system in place for continuity, political continuity. If anything, I would think that once Fidel and Raul are gone, then in that vacuum, you're just going to have corruption, because probably Fidel was the only one left with the authority to tell people, don't allow any corruption, don't allow drug dealing, don't allow human trafficking, or any kind of host of problems that, if you think about it, in Cuba, there's economic desperation. And wherever there's economic desperation, people are going to do what they can to survive. And we don't have much knowledge about any of this, because things are so controlled in Cuba and we're so isolated from Cuba, that I promise you one day soon we're going to learn about this rampant corruption going on. And again, that's not to say that there isn't rampant corruption in the United States, in the state of Florida, in the city of Sarasota. But we don't necessarily know about. There's still an accounting to be made on all this, and especially without Fidel there, you can just imagine the kind of corruption going on because of the economic despair. Whether it's money laundering from tourism, especially if the Cuban Communist Party and the military is so heavily invested in tourism, you can just imagine the kind of graft and corruption. Build a hotel here, tear down the whole neighborhood. The communist bureaucrat pockets some money, launders it to Miami, and that's probably more commonplace. And the average Cuban who's not part of the political party might not have access to those connections, and they just are suffering because there's no system that's making sure they have enough food to eat, enough gasoline. So these paintings, I think, really kind of comment on Fidel Castro being kind of a relic at this point, as much as kind of commenting on Cuba just falling apart altogether. I'm going to show you, and something like this on the other extreme, I don't think this has much overt reference to Cuba. So this maybe falls into that other camp where artists are now kind of just making art on a world stage, with all this international cross-pollination, and making really high quality art that doesn't need to have any palm trees or Che Guevaras or mojitos. And yet, that the question still remains: if these artists are trained by the Cuban Revolution, do they have an obligation to celebrate and promote Cuba, and what is that obligation, and does it need to be overt, or and you could say it depends on the artist, and it maybe depends on their work. Maybe you could see political significance in this. Maybe there isn't that. Maybe artists don't feel that obligation to honor the revolution anymore, perhaps especially after the death of Fidel Castro. As an average Cuban, I would probably feel like, well, what is the revolution? Who are we fighting against now? You could say, well, the United States and the embargo, and there's certainly some validity to that. But in a way, you've got these two, you're between a rock and a hard place, these totally static and mobile forces that aren't willing to give way. The United States isn't going to end the embargo until the Communist Party has open, fair, free elections, whatever you want to call it, which we will probably interfere in, and we will probably, only allow our puppet pro-US, leader to take power. So we probably won't even allow them to be open and fair elections. But even if we don't do that, you can imagine what that might do to Cuba just once the forces of capitalism, Coca-Cola, are they going to buy out all the farmland in Cuba again? Hopefully not. But I think the sad reality is the next few decades, Cubans might be the ones who just have to suffer until one of those two forces gives. It's the classic story of the unstoppable force against the immovable object, right? The unstoppable force is like United States and capitalism and globalization, and the immovable object is, your needs for sovereignty as a nation, the importance of you having self-determination. And those are two very, powerful forces. And yet one of those kind of needs to give in order for the Cubans to have some sense of agency or control over their destiny. And we'll talk more about that next class when we talk about protests in Cuba today. But yeah, one would say one outpowers the other. Yeah. And, so it's really a sad moment in Cuba right now. And I wonder, what will the next generation of artists do? Are they going to stay in Cuba? Are they going to continue to benefit from being able to travel abroad? And or with the death of Fidel, does that mean now the art world won't be so interested in Cuba as a kind of, exception to the commercialization around the world? Now, I will say this about this artist. There's something, one of the things that I love the most about Cuban art and this artist and many Cuban artists is they're not, the art isn't, so it's not commercialized. It's not trying to be flashy or sexual or just kind of trying to catch your attention the way capitalism just kind of wants to commodify things. There's something wonderfully kind of free from that Andy Warhol influence, where it's all about glamour and fashion and status and celebrity. So as long as that continues in Cuba, I think it will continue to be a really wonderful exception to the norm in the art world, which is so defined by like Jeff Koons and Andy Warhol, to the point that it's just so kind of, it's almost reaches the level of kind of, it's so kind of formulaic and or narcissistic and or kind of wanting to prostitute itself to like the art world. And so much of the art world is about making money and making, buying stuff that's sort of fashionable, but doesn't, like, think about the history of art. It's rooted in kind of religion, and then it becomes serving, nationalism. And today, I think art is more like anything goes. But in Cuba, that's not quite the case, because, Cuba does still have certain parameters, being isolated, being an island, being trained, artists are trained by the revolution. So they're very much kind of, their whole training is built into the system as a whole. And, you can't really, separate one from the other. And I think that's what's so interesting about looking at all these artists, is kind of each one finds some kind of happy balance between kind of being within the revolution, maybe being outside the revolution, being true to Cuba, being true to your own creativity. You got to love this sculptural, McCarthy almost kind of has this influence, this kind of semi-sexualized, somewhat nostalgic quality. But, there's something distinct even about this than, what we see here, which feels like maybe somewhat sexual, but still without being so kind of, I don't know, something almost perverse, like you see with Paul McCarthy. I love Paul McCarthy, but you almost feel like the kind of, like his work is a perverted, like the alpha to the omega. Like he's kind of taking that shallow Disneyland language and sexualizing and perverting it, because there is almost something almost shallow and perverted about Disney. Yeah, you have to kind of look at Paul McCarthy's work. He's not a Cuban, but I can see that as a response to the commercialization of California. Whereas this artist, whose work kind of has a similar quality, it doesn't feel so kind of nihilistic, perhaps. But this, I think, is one of the artists you guys are really going to love. And this is a wonderful uh, kind of someone who follows in the blueprints, perhaps the footprints of Wilfredo Lamb. And I think also has a really wonderful commentary on globalization as a kind of form of neo-colonization. And you can see this artist pedigree here, how far and wide he's traveled. And I think you can already appreciate just from the kind of quality of his work here on the right, with his body being perforated by flags as a kind of symbol of colonialism. And so he is a really important figure today as a bellwether of commenting on, the nature of the legacy of colonialism, the idea of the human body as being kind of a oppression, a source of a place of oppression. And I think obviously, reconciling with the history of slavery and, treatment of African culture in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And perhaps, maybe even as some of that Ana Mendieta bold quality of using their body as a canvas. But I think here he's, really taking the possibility of, I think especially what we talked about earlier, Cuba as a place that stands up against imperialism, stands up against the United States. And I think it's a very shrewd move by the artist to take to take the kind of idea of standing up to imperialism. And though he's not necessarily standing up specifically to the United States, I think it's really wonderful that he's broadening that lens. So he's really commenting on like globalization as a whole. This work refers to the historical oppression, racism, and systemic violence suffered by populations of the former British colonies, both outside and within the United Kingdom. So, this is an artist who's from Cuba commenting on the history of colonialism, but I think really also looking at British colonialism. Briefly, Cuba was subject to Britain as a colony, but I don't think it mattered necessarily as England so much. It's just the idea of colonization and the idea of what does it mean to be colonized, not so much necessarily on the outside, but to be colonized on the inside. And that I think is so relevant because, all of us have to question, what does it mean to be capitalistic on the outside, but also on the inside? What does that mean for our soul? And, using the human body to reclaim these art institutions is really, I think, partly what's going on here, especially when you look at, him putting himself into a place, not in this case so much as maybe something like this, where he's in an art gallery performing a piece. There's something so bold and wonderful, kind of like the Trojan horse idea with Fredo Lamb, putting your body, black body, maybe gay body, nude body into the gallery, into a public space, and kind of like a Trojan horse, you're going into the heart of the art world and kind of exploding it from within. And there's incredibly bold works of art. It kind of reminds me of Robert Mapplethorpe confronting people with male nudity, homosexuality, different, racial beauty. And, I think really he's kind of someone else who kind of from the United States who similarly kind of used the body as a source of, metaphor and also identity and oppression and, beauty, especially here, like, he's in the Guggenheim standing, with his hands shackled. And, this says the work reflects on the structural racism and political and systematic violence historically suffered by the Black and immigrant body in the United States. So here, overtly pointing out that the body is more than just, your individual, contains your identity, but it's a sort of, it is a kind of cultural sort of source of pain and suffering and violence. And, putting his naked body into the Guggenheim is really kind of reminds me a lot of with Fredo Lamb's work here, reclaiming sugarcane and reclaiming your autonomy as a slave, with his famous work, The Jungle, and even perhaps a reference to, this long variegated history or varied history of, being an African in Cuba, someone who's a fish out of water and struggling with creating your own sense of identity, having been forcibly relocated from your home country, so totally untethered from your geographical, homeland, and having to basically rebuild your identity from scratch and building on whatever you have on the inside, because you have no control over anything on the outside. The only thing you really have control over is, your beliefs, your attitude, your culture. And that's, a very bittersweet reality. if not, a nightmarish reality that people had to live with for hundreds of years. And, even these paintings we saw by this artist, Landalus, kind of shows you the other extreme kind of caricaturist quality of kind of rebuilding that sense of identity from scratch. And I think you could almost see a reference to those paintings here. And just so the body is a source of expression. And I do think his work is very much kind of recognizably Cuban, but also with a wider lens. And I think a very fitting follow-up from what we saw with Wilfredo Lam, likewise focusing more on like Haiti and the Afro-Cuban or the African experience in the greater Caribbean. To its credit, Cuban art, you don't see that Andy Warhol kind of soullessness, that kind of fashion and glamour at the expense of kind of substance and depth. You don't necessarily have a Jeff Koons or a Damien Hirst, no Carl Andre. But also, no Diego Rivera. You don't have a tradition of muralism in Cuba. You don't also have a tradition of a purely abstract art, abstract expression. And the question, what we'll think about next class is there a Banksy? Does Cuba have the equivalent of like a Basquiat, someone who's like a street artist who rises up into the art world because they're sort of the quote unquote voice of the gutter, as they say in the movie Basquiat? So next week, we'll look at artists who are actually working on the street and who are artists who aren't necessarily, trained by the revolution, and operate kind of therefore freely from those kind of institutional supports. And I think we'll be, and you'll see when we look at the artists, they're kind of pushing buttons, increasingly taking more risks with their art. And I think that's definitely as a function of Cuba's, or in direct inverse proportion to Cuba's declining state. So the more, for instance, the more decay you see on the street, the more acceptable it is to put graffiti on the walls to revitalize it. And that's true in parts of the United States or anywhere in the world wherever there's increased decay, you're going to find increased kind of openness to allowing people to revitalize those places with art, or people just won't care that you're painting because there's already enough decay that no one cares as much. So that's what we're going to look at next week, with a lot of these artists kind of literally painting on these deteriorating walls and surfaces in Havana. And this is much more common today because there isn't that kind of revolutionary big brothers watching you, because there just isn't that kind of fervor. You no longer have Che Guevara or Fidel. And so I think that's going to be something that is both a positive and a negative. You're going to have a lot of corruption in Cuba, but you're also going to have a lot more opportunities for artists to push the boundaries. And eventually all this is going to converge with, some artists in Cuba getting arrested for pushing the buttons too deeply, too hard, too firmly. And we will hear about it, hopefully. And I wouldn't be surprised if these artists are really, these are the ones who are right now kind of creating the imagery that's going to inspire people to take to the streets and start, challenging the revolution, and perhaps even pushing for one of those forces to give, whether it's the United States maybe ending the embargo, even if there aren't fair elections, or Cuba allowing fair elections, open elections, and maybe risking changing the status quo. But certainly having tourism in a country where there's deterioration everywhere gives you a bad taste as a tourist. And I think, when you go to Cuba, you'll probably feel a similar sense of like, a lot of people in Havana are really desperate to the point that they just will see you as, a chance to, get some kind of help. And so it might be hard to get that real authentic, quote unquote, tourist experience in a country where you're totally out of step economically with the locals. And certainly if you're someone with a sense of ethics, it's very hard to justify going to a really poor country and benefiting from the poverty while everyone is in the country can barely, afford to eat the next meal. So next class, we'll talk more about the current economic situation in Cuba and look at these graffiti artists who are kind of the equivalent of your Banksys.